Thank you. Okay, so today's program is going to be on mental health disorders, a scientific perspective on what we know, what we don't know, and where we're headed. And as always, I want to thank you for hosting our humanist group here. Thank Maggie and Diana for doing the tech support in the background. I also want to thank the American Humanist Association for their Harvard-run chapter grant, which does help us put on some of these programs. So we've got 4 excellent speakers today. Mark Reimers, a bunch of you may know, he was the leader of Richmond Humanists for about half a decade before moving back to Michigan. He's a neuroscientist, he has a background in statistics and in genomics, and an interest in both evolution and some psychiatric and mental health problems. Arnold Woodruff is mostly retired after 45 years in public health. He's been working at state mental hospitals, serving as director of community mental health clinic, and director of a federal grant providing mental health services to children and adolescents. Andy Thomson has been here several times. He can never seem to say no. He's a psychiatrist in Charlottesville, takes care of the students at UVA, also has a forensic practice, has written a very accessible book called Facing Bipolar that can help families and adolescents and adults with bipolar disorder understand what they're going through and help them through it. He also has a very strong interest in evolutionary psychology, and we'll talk about that today. And then Candace Gorham, we've met before also. She was sick on our last, or actually, was in the middle of moving on our last mental health program, but was able to make it down today, so thank you very much for coming. Candace is an author of the Exodus Project, just has a master's in mental health counseling from Wake Forest. She's worked with troubled teens in a group home setting, as well as being a member of the Secular Therapist Project. So thank all of you guys for coming. I want to say that I have a sense of what some of you speak about, and less so about others. So as we go along, if I ask a question to Mark and one of you guys want to jump in, please do so. By the same token, if somebody's talking about something and you have an interesting insight or question, I'd be happy to have this as more of a conversation as opposed to an interview. I will get the ball started. We're going to have a circulating microphone, so if anybody in the audience has questions, maybe feel free to catch Rachel's eye in the back. She's always happy to help. Or Jason. You just raise your hand if you work on audience questions too. Mark, to get things started, the brain is probably what sets humanity apart. Assuming that you get rid of the mystical soul, and most of us here don't have a magical belief in that, the brain is really what sets us apart. So can you kind of walk us through, go back a few million years, and then walk us forward to where we are now? And then after that, Andy, I'm going to ask you to talk about how evolutionary psychology ties in and how that shares in mental health issues.
Okay, thanks, Rob. You all hear me? No. I normally take about 90 minutes to do a talk on the human brain evolution, but the short version is that if you compare our brains to the brains of other non-human primates, or other primates who are not human, all of the structures are analogous. That is, any part of the brain we can find in us, we can find also in a chimpanzee or a bonobo or an orangutan. They are, of course, in our... Sure, is that better? Of course, our brains are substantially bigger. In fact, they are sort of roughly twice the size that they should be for a creature of our body size. And that's presumably, played an important role in human evolution. But that's not the only difference. So we often, think, well, just bigger brains means we're smarter, right? It's that simple. Well, no, it's not, actually. There's a weak correlation between brain size and IQ among human beings, but, if we want to think about intelligence, we should keep in mind, if we think brain size is so special, keep in mind that Neanderthals had substantially bigger brains than we do, and that our remote ancestors 50,000 years ago had substantially bigger brains than we do. We're sort of shrinking. Maybe that's not... Maybe there's some evidence of that, but anyway. But what else is different? It's pretty clear that just having more neurons doesn't make you necessarily wiser or more intelligent in the broad sense. Perhaps gives you more resources to play with. But there are 2 other key differences that sort of separate us from the apes. One of them is that we generate a lot more of our activity internally than monkeys or apes do. That is, if you catch a human brain at rest in a dark room, there's lots going on. If you catch a monkey brain at rest in a dark room, there's stuff going on, but not nearly as much. And if you shine a bright light at that monkey's eyes, the brain really reacts. If you shine a bright light at our eyes, then our brain reacts, but substantially less. A lot more of our activities internally generated than in a monkey. Secondly, although just about every area of our brain is sort of scaled up proportionally relative to our primate ancestors, meaning that we have twice as big an auditory cortex, we have twice as big an association parietal association areas, all of these sorts of things. There's an area that is much bigger than it should be proportionally, which you can see if you compare in detail anatomical maps, and that's an area just in front of, sort of behind the bridge of your nose. It's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and it sort of shades into an area called the orbital frontal cortex behind your eyebrows. Both of those areas are much smaller in chimpanzees proportionally. So you might ask, okay, that's probably important. Turns out that also we have a large number of very high speed or very big neurons that connect these areas to every other part of the brain. They're called von Economo neurons or spindle cells for those of you who follow any of this. So they basically enable really rapid communication in a hundredth of a second between these areas and the rest of your brain. So you might ask, okay, so that's cool. That's a key ingredient of being human. What does this area of the brain do? Well, it turns out, of course, we don't know its job description. We don't have a nice annotation for it, but it's an area that gets particularly active if you are facing morally ambiguous situations, especially those that involve loyalty or breaking loyalty to someone you love or care about, or you're about to lose someone you love or care about. If people love these moral dilemma problems, if you put someone in an fMRI scanner and make them contemplate a moral dilemma where it seems like there's two bad choices and both of them would bring them into conflict with sort of what they believe to be right, then that area of the brain is working very hard. If you ask someone to imagine what life would be like if their spouse died, or if they still have a living parent, what would happen when that parent is gone, that area of the brain is very active. It's also intriguing that the best correlation that's ever been noted between any aspect of brain anatomy and any aspect of human behavior is a correlation between the size of this region and the amount to which loyalty matters to you as a personal value. It's the best correlation that's ever been observed between a psychological, measurable psychological trait and a bit of brain anatomy. So it suggests, again, that this kind of group identification and group loyalty has been, or long-lasting relationships has been an important part of human evolution, and probably we should pay some attention to that. So that's the short answer.
So that's perhaps a little unfair to ask you to give a 90-minute lecture in 4 minutes, but so taking that the human brain has evolved in somewhat different paths to allow us to have society, civilization, language, all the things we do. Andy, can you talk about what does the brain do for us? What are the jobs it solves from an evolutionary perspective? Why do we have brains? What's the goal of every organism? And then how does that tie into mental health?
If you go back to Darwin's classic, The Origin of Species, if you look at the next to the last paragraph, Darwin says psychology will be based on a new foundation. So Darwin's genius extended to realizing that the implication of his theory of evolution by natural selection, would impact our understanding of psychology. And in a sense, the great uninvited guest at the origin of the species was man. He didn't mention human beings, though we were clearly in the shadow, so to speak, and on his mind. At the end of the book, he knows quite clearly that our understanding of human nature would change. And it really took about 150 years before it, in a way, got taken seriously. And a group of largely psychologists, but some anthropologists, started to reconceptualize psychology through the lens of evolution. And you had in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the birth of what is now called evolutionary psychology. It was originally called sociobiology, but the real, I think, flowering of it comes in the early 1990s. And the idea here is that the mind is what the brain does, and the brain evolved under the same laws of evolution that every other organism and every other piece of living tissue. Connected to what Mark says, that our brains are primate brains, and our species evolved like other species, slowly, gradually, and our brains evolved. And we're also an ancient species. The other insight of evolutionary psychology is that in our modern skull is basically a Stone Age brain, that for every year since we settled into agricultural communities, every year since that 10,000 years ago, there were about 1,000 years in which our ancestors lived in small hunter-gatherer bands. So really two crucial ideas here, that the brain evolved under the rules of natural selection, and it's primarily adapted for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle on the plains of Africa, that we're basically underneath our, put aside all of our ethnic, racial, religious, political differences, we're basically all Africans. All 7 billion of us are the descendants of somewhere between 600 and 2,000 individuals that lived about, I think, 70,000 years ago. And those are the two fundamental insights, so that our psychology was forged in the furnaces of Africa, and that you want to look at minds through the lens of evolution by natural selection. So where does that then dovetail to Rob's question about how does this translate into our understanding of emotional suffering? And there's been, I think, extraordinary work done on such phenomena as anxiety, depression. And I've been particularly interested in depression, and depression as having a function, as at least the basic design of depression being an adaptation. That we get depressed when we're faced with very difficult, crucial interpersonal problems. And we're basically a social species. But if you're interested in a topic, I would encourage you to, just Google evolutionary psychology. There are all sorts of, I think, excellent articles you can pull up pretty quickly that'll get you up to speed on this. And I think there's very interesting work being done in all aspects of clinical psychology, psychiatry. You see very good work on depression, anxiety, eating disorders, personality disorders. Very good work, I think, done on the question of suicide, non-suicidal self-injury, and looking through it through an evolutionary lens.
Arnold was actually kind enough to provide us with some resources. So there's some of those up on the table. They're also posted on the Richmond Humanists website and SavedByScience website. I'd invite the speakers, if you guys do have what you think are some very good resources, please just email those to me. I'll post them on the site if anybody is interested. Candace, you work with teenagers. The way the brain has evolved, a baby and a teenager and a full-grown adult aren't the same. And so if you have a 15-year-old, they have very different risk tolerance and a lot of things when the frontal cortex isn't wired in. Can you talk about some of the problems you run into clinically when working with teens?
Oh gosh, some of the problems. Teens. Has anybody ever seen a teenager? Like everything that's wrong with teenagers. But no, I mean, if you're thinking about like brain development and stuff, I know one thing that we've started to consider some of the behavioral disorders, attention, impulsive disorders, more as developmental disorders because of how they do change as the brain develops and how the brain changes. Oftentimes you see like an impulsive, like ADHD, for example, in a child might be impulsive behavior and inability to focus. Whereas as they grow up and the brain develops differently, the some of the impulsivity might settle down, but the inability to focus remains an issue. Y'all have to forgive me, I got a cold if you can't tell. And but I think that impulsivity and that inability to regulate emotions, those are issues that you're having with those are things that are developing over time. Those things often cause the most problems. And then if you add on top of that, of course, in my group home setting, you're talking about guys who often come to us with a lot of trauma, a lot of neglect, a lot of abuse. Some of them may have been born addicted to substances, which of course is going to have a massive impact on brain development. And so we see where there's evidence, for example, that like PTSD changes brain functioning. All of these different things can kind of create these perfect storms where if you're talking about a teenager who already maybe had ADHD, who now, grew up in a traumatic situation, and, you add all of this stuff together, and a lot of times our guys are coming to us. I was just telling somebody this morning, I do other stuff. In addition to working in the group home, I'm also like sort of kind of clinical director of another mental health agency where they have a really expensive, it's a really advanced, very complicated program that it takes a whole lot for the kids to qualify for. And I help do the assessments, and I review the assessments and stuff to make sure that the kids qualify for them. And, a lot of times these are kids that have criminal records. I mean, I've got one right now. I mean, they have, felony assault charges. And, these kids, the behaviors are just really over the top. And oftentimes, like I said, by the time you combine, slow brain development because of whatever, in addition to the trauma, those sorts of experiences. PTSD, we see a whole lot of PTSD, believe it or not. Like clinical criteria for PTSD. You combine all of those things together, you just end up with, like I said, we end up with dealing with a lot of impulsivity, violence, aggression, defiance, just really the behaviors tend to be the really difficult thing. And then even on top of that is that emotion regulation also tends to be a surprising issue where, they can get angry so fast and they don't have the, coping skills to calm themselves down. Or you add on top of that, the impulsivity. They don't even take the moment to think, oh, maybe I should use my coping skills. They may have the coping skills, but because they're so impulsive, they can't even think to use the coping skills. So it's just really difficult to figure out exactly how to get through to each of them, sometimes in different ways, because, the brain development may have, those things impacted in such a way that it's like, well, that's the brain that child has. There's not, and then, I got to figure out how to help them develop the coping skills because this is the brain that they have. And then oftentimes they're working with staff as, I'm a licensed clinician, so I can look at it that way. But especially in a group home setting, you have, a lot of the staff there, they only have a high school degree, so they're coming to it with very minimal understanding of behavioral and psychological disorders. And so it's kind of hard to sometimes convince them that this child, you can't treat this child the same way you maybe treat your own child. Well, sometimes we have to go, and your child is in services too, right? Like, I've got this one lady, she loves to brag about how she's not afraid to deal with them because her sons. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so maybe we shouldn't use the same parenting styles that you use with your sons with these kids, because your son's in services. So anyway, so it's a very interesting thing to try to deal with the teenagers and stuff, because we know that brain development is such a big part of it.
So Andy, does anything jump to mind for you with a teenager with some of the tendencies that they have where that served an evolutionary purpose a few thousand years ago, to be impulsive or to take risks?
And my understanding from the experts is that you want to look at the teenage years as practicing the social skills that they're going to need as an adult. And the idea is that even, starting, one of the analogies I like is if you look at primates, the play is early versions of adult behavior. And teenagers are becoming sexually mature, and so they're learning about relationships, and particularly romantic relationships, peer relationships, and that's what's going to shape them. And the evidence is now that we're shaped more by our peers than our parents, and so the teenage years are where you start to learn social and romantic relationships, because those are with peers, because that's what's going to carry you into adulthood. And I think that's a useful lens to look at. And that one of the questions that the evolutionary psychology people look at is, why do we have this long teenage or this long adolescence relative to other primate species? And I think that's another aspect of our humanity that makes us different from other primates, this long teenage or adolescent phase. And it's because learning to be an adult human is so difficult, particularly the sociality of being an adult human, that you need this long period of time to master those skills.
But I think also, though, my understanding is that some of the reasons we have prolonged adolescence is economic. That 100 or 200 years ago, you were going to be taking on adult responsibilities much earlier because you were going to die sooner, so you had to have babies in your teens. Well, now economically we can't afford that, so we socially it lengthened the time it takes. And maybe that's also because we're more complicated world that we have to learn to adapt to.
Well, my understanding is a little bit different from that. And that when they look at what are called natural fertility populations, the remaining hunter-gatherer tribes, the first child is still not until 18 or 19. And then,
As opposed to 30.
Yeah, well, but as opposed to, poor communities here, 12, 14. And then puberty in the modern world, for dietary reasons, I think, largely is coming on earlier. And so one of the mismatches between our normal development historically and what we now have is early puberty, I think particularly in girls.
Arnold, you've intimated that neurobiology seems to play a surprisingly small role in the etiology of behaviors that we classify as mental illness. And you're not postulating anything magical like the soul, but so what are you talking about when you say the biology doesn't explain as much as we thought it might?
Well, what I think is that at the present moment, in terms of the knowledge that we have, and again, when I was thinking about this, I realized I'm on the panel to represent what we don't know, more than to say what we do know. And I'm a practitioner, and I don't have access to the latest research. Everything I know is pretty much secondhand. But my understanding is that at the moment, we don't have any firm biological markers for any of the mental health disorders that we diagnose. There's no blood test, there's no brain scan, there's no x-ray, there's no MRI, there's nothing else that we have other than somebody's judgment of somebody else's behavior. And that the correlations, and again, I get some of this from Mark, is pretty low. There are some correlations, but they don't represent a huge ability to predict or diagnose a mental health disorder based on anything about how the brain functions. And that some of what we see in folks with longer-term mental illness, Dr. Insel, when he left the National Institute of Mental Health, suggested that we need to maybe rethink the long-term use of the psychoactive medications because they are also impacting on brain structure and function, and may well be creating partly what we're trying to treat.
Could I jump into that and respond to that? So could we distinguish first a biological correlate of mental illness from a genetic basis of mental illness? The two are often conflated in the popular press. So we talk about a gene for schizophrenia or a gene for depression. Well, there is no such gene. So yes, I used to work in psychiatric genetics. I still work in psychiatric genetics. So, but that's different from saying that there is a biological correlate. So there's a biological correlate to your thoughts right now. There are calcium channels opening in your neurons, and there are various metabolic processes going on in specific neurons rather than in other neurons that are specific to your thoughts right now. So everything has a biological correlate. It may not be very obvious what it might be, but let's come back to that. Let's first deal with the genetics. So if I am a well-trained geneticist and I pick up a piece of your DNA, let's say from a coffee cup that you've been drinking from, like this teacup here, all right, so I could give this to one of my colleagues who's never met me, who's a geneticist, and he could tell me, for example, that when I had hair, I had brown hair. He could also tell me that I would be balding early, that if I'm more than 50, I've probably lost most of that hair. He could also tell me roughly, assuming I've had normal nutrition, roughly how tall I am. He could tell me my eye color is green. He could tell me that my skin color is white, and also a particular kind of white. That there are a variety of shades of skin tone among European descendants. He could tell me what kind of earwax I have. He could tell me, 100 other things that are mostly inconsequential, but are of some interest to forensic investigations if they're trying to identify. Some police departments are using these sort of genetic programs to get rough sketches of potential suspects in crimes just from the DNA that they've left at the scene of the crime. So you can construct that kind of thing. But if you give me some DNA, or if I give some DNA, that person can tell me nothing about whether I'm extroverted or introverted, whether I'm conscientious or irresponsible, whether I am likely to be depressed or not. We have essentially no genetic information, whether I'm going to be autistic or not. So, I know people who are engaged in this. We often say autism is essentially genetic, and there's a good deal of truth to that. But we can't say there's certainly no autism gene. And at the moment, the best people in the world who are trying to look at DNA and figure out who's autistic just from their DNA can't do it at all, period, nothing. So there's not any obvious, connection between our DNA and our behavioral traits the way there is, between, whether or not I have curly hair or whether I have, white skin or dark skin. So that's, I think one thing to keep separate from the issue, is there a biology of mental illness, or is there a biological correlate of mental illness? And I would disagree with Arnold. I think that in many cases there is, but it's not necessarily something that's in the genes, so to speak. So I think that's probably where we agree. But I think there's something happening in the brains of people, and we are, I think, beginning to understand what kinds of things are going on in the brains of people with different kinds of mental illnesses. And I think it's fair to say, Arnold, that it's not so clear that there's a single kind of biological correlate that goes with any DSM diagnosis. It's not that there's a single kind of process that goes on in your brain that makes you schizophrenic, as opposed to another kind of process that makes you bipolar, as opposed to another kind of process that makes you depressed. It turns out that in all of these processes, there's sort of gradients. And it's, how your distress manifests itself depends, we think, on your cultural context, your family context, your friendships, as much as on the intrinsic biology of what's going on in your cells.
So, Mark, what I was going to ask you is that we sequenced the human genome 14 years ago, and have we seen the explosion in understanding that we expected? I think you pretty well just spelled that out. Andy, is there anything in the psychiatric literature that's different or supports what Mark is saying? Like, do you see hopes for our new genetic understanding, or better understanding of the genome that's going to help us with mental illness?
I would agree with Mark and Arnold. I think the evidence today is that the hope for finding, a gene or a couple of genes for schizophrenia, or a gene or a couple of genes for bipolar illness, I don't think we're going to have that. The evidence now is that it looks as if they're just many, many different genes, and they have small effects, and I think we're going to have to recognize that, and that treatments are not going to be a specific genetic manipulation. I think Mark probably knows better than I, but I think they found like 1,700 different illnesses or traits that are Mendelian, where you can identify, a gene, say like Huntington's, and that's what drove the hope. Huntington's in Korea had one gene, and when it was discovered, people became enthusiastic. Well, if Huntington's is this way, then maybe schizophrenia and maybe the severe mental illnesses are the same way. And it's just not turned out that way. And it's just, if you think about it, and if you back up and think about it, think of all the genes that probably go into what I'm thinking and saying to you. Well, and it's going to be that many genes that are going to be involved in disturbances in my behavior, or a significant number, and it'll be slight mutations in that, with small effects, and I think we have to get used to that.
Well, I was going to say, so I think back to what Candace was talking about, the fact that so many of the folks that we see with diagnoses of whatever mental health have histories with, including some sort of trauma, including the research now on adverse childhood experiences. So it's not necessarily a focal traumatic event or events. It can be just, for example, if you live in a city, you're more likely to get diagnosed with those severe mental illness than if you live in the country. So it's incredibly, as I said to Mark, and this, I'm quoting someone, who knew it was so complicated?
So I would like to head into that field if we can get Candace and you guys chime in. Candace, you have an interest in epigenetics. Can you sort of tell us where that came from, and then everybody can chime in, like this is a broad area where maybe it's a very fruitful area to look at. Oh, perfect.
Well, I wanted to first chime in about this stuff because, my understanding is certain, like if you were to do brain scans, right? So we're not necessarily talking about genetic stuff, but just in terms of activity areas, areas that, like with substance use, there's certain, I guess what they call the pleasure sensors, right? Is that a thing? Or is this like sort of a
That's a media
psychology?
creation. It's a media creation.
Right. Some sort of overly simplified, right? Or like we know, serotonin, boost the mood, those sorts of things that there's something in the way of activity that I wonder what's going on there. Like I said, it may not necessarily be genetic markers or that sort of thing, but what's going on with the different areas of the brain that are active or that are, active or underactive or overactive, and the correlation between those and certain, disorders that we see, those types of patterns. But as far as epigenetics, I remember I was just reading about PTSD, and again, this is not really a thing, but secondary PTSD. So this idea that it's sort of like something that you didn't do or you didn't experience, but you were exposed to, somebody who felt it or experienced it or whatever. And I've been reading an article about this incidence of with like Holocaust survivors and this idea, so the epigenetics being this sort of flipping a gene on and off. So the genetic part being this sort of like this, gene flips on or off or something in relation to, because of the trauma of the Holocaust and having been a Holocaust survivor. And what they were finding was that those genes were similarly expressed in like children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So obviously not necessarily that there's a causal relationship, but there was this correlation that was significant enough to make them go, what's going on there? You know, why are these genes flipped on or off over here in the same way as their grandparents? And there's sort of some correlation between that sort of epigenetic thing. I guess I'll let them explain it further.
Okay, somebody jump in and sort of explain the science behind how that epigenetics works, why it can be passed on to kids, you know, what happens at the DNA level?
Sure. So there's, besides the bases in your DNA, the bases can be chemically modified. And although when you pass on your DNA to your children, most of those chemical modifications are removed, a few of them stay on. And we think, based on animal and plant studies, that some of the characteristics that you have perhaps even acquired, but that have marked your DNA, can be transmitted for a generation or two. So this is not a permanent change in your DNA, and eventually these extra chemical marks will wash out. They're called methylation marks, as the main kind. There's several other kinds of marks, but it's basically like a little molecule of methane gas, natural gas, stuck onto certain bases in your DNA. And basically, if you have this methane molecule stuck on a base in DNA, it sort of occludes that base from the machinery that sort of reads and writes or interprets the DNA, so that a certain switch may be inactive. You may not be able, a switch that may turn off on a stress response may become inactive, so that you are kept, you keep your stress response on for longer. And that kind of thing, there's the evidence for human transmission is still kind of ambiguous. The study you cited, done at Boston, where looking at Holocaust survivors, suggestive, but not. We haven't really replicated that yet or found a general trend. But it seems plausible based on animal studies where it can be transmitted. These kinds of epigenetic marks can be transmitted for a generation or two. So,
can I just come in to clarify? I'll ask you maybe, this may have just been on Curiosity Stream on a sciencey video, but I did not go and look at any paper. My understanding was that some of the epigenetics through methylation could get transmitted for tens of generations. They said even up to 100. And I don't know if it was a human study or if this was animal studies.
well, we don't have human data that goes 10 generations. We have human data that might go 2.
I did just see a study, and I didn't quite understand the methodology, but I think it was worms, and they did say that they were able to trace for 7 generations.
And they were talking about it in the context of, it's not nearly as stable as DNA, but if there's a significant environmental change, this actually could be very adaptive, that people, if you're facing starvation and drought, maybe the next few generations treat water and food differently. Andy?
No, I'm glad somebody brought up epigenetics. I'd encourage you to Google epigenetics and Google epigenetics and images, and Google epigenetics and substance abuse, epigenetics and depression. I think it's one of the most interesting discoveries, and one of the images that has helped me is spools, that if this thread is your DNA, the DNA is wrapped around histones, and that this is how experience is translated into genetic expression. And as Mark was saying, if a methyl group is on there, the DNA does not open up and transcribe. There are other experiences or things that signal for it to open up and transcribe, and this is how experience gets translated into genetic expression. And there's very interesting work out there now that if I start using cocaine is going to obviously hit the pleasure centers of my brain, the nucleus accumbens, but even more, if I keep doing cocaine, it's going to affect the genetic expression in my brain in that area, and that those changes in my brain induced by the cocaine, and changing genetic expression may be one of the things that leads me to become a cocaine addict. Similarly, it looks like there's epigenetic changes in if I were to take a lot of oxycodone. If I start taking a lot of oxycodone, it's a similar sort of thing. It's actually going to trigger genetic changes, and maybe one of the things that is contributing to the terrible, oxycodone, the opioid epidemic that we now have. And what Arnold was talking about earlier, now there's clear information that certain adverse child experiences may affect genetic expression and genetic expression on your stress system going forward. What does this have to do with mental health? There's really good work now with correlation between substance abuse diagnoses, substance abuse problems, and how people score on a thing called adverse childhood experiences. You can, when you first interview patients and get them to fill out these questionnaires on adverse childhood experiences, there's this pretty strong correlation between that and substance abuse. Early abuse, we know, is a risk factor for later depression. And I think a lot of it is in the epigenetics. But I think we're still waiting for, there's a lot of hope among the neuroscientists that they can reverse some of these epigenetic changes. And it was actually found that one of the old antidepressants, one of the old tricyclic antidepressants actually impacted epigenetic change. And it turns out one of the medicines we're using for bipolar illness, Depakote, seems to impact epigenetic changes. So that's a whole new area that I don't think anybody anticipated.
Andy, I don't know if you can maybe bend your mic because that's coming out. Is there anything anybody else wanted to add about epigenetics, maybe from a humanist perspective?
One of the things about all of this talk about brain development, etc., all of that doesn't happen in any vacuum. It happens in a social sphere, the community, the family, the culture, etc. So, and a lot of the things we're talking about that creating these epigenetic changes are the result of things that happen in the environment. One of the things that I'm interested in is, are there other experiences that can reverse epigenetic but aren't chemical? The areas of the brain that Mark was talking about that help mark us as humans is also the areas of the brain that were cut off during frontal lobotomies, and people became very calm and easy to deal with. And we do that to some extent with our chemicals now, and I'm hoping that, I think there's a role and a need for medications. I'm not completely anti, but I do think we over-rely on that, and I would like to see if we can't find other experiences and behaviors that people have that can also reverse, because those epigenetic changes happen as a result of experience. Are there experiences that would reverse it?
Well, that makes me think, with kids especially, I do a lot of work around building resilience. And that goes with what you're saying, that, building the skills necessary to survive these, survive whatever. Resilience being this idea of being able to bounce back. Two kids growing up in the same home, in the same environment, with the same parents. Why does one go on to be, a drug addict and the other go on to be, not whatever, successful? There's some research that show, looking at when we start talking about personality development, we're talking about resilience. And so what are these characteristics, and characteristics being things like, okay, we're valuing education, what kind of sense of humor do you have? So there are personal resilience factors that, we can tap into those with kids, or adults or whatever, but tap into those to try to affect that sort of change like you're talking about without medication.
Arnold, I've heard if you told me about a study or just a different sort of treatment plan where here in the U.S. you might take somebody with severe mental health disorders and separate them from their family, medicate them, and lock them up, versus embedding them in a supportive social network. Can you, I forgot if it was you or Andy, but could you guys talk about that?
No, I learned this from Arnold in Finland.
Yes, it's Jaakko Sekula, it's section on the resources. It's called Open Dialogue, and he's been doing this since about 1985. And basically, when someone, and it's primarily folks with first or second episodes of psychotic behavior, and brings in, I think the way they define it is whoever cares about this person, and has basically conversations, and they're not necessarily therapy conversations, but they are to maintain a social network and a social connection. And generally, the system that we have tends to isolate people. In fact, a lot of adolescent treatment programs, your family can't visit you for 30 days. Just nuts. Just nuts. But, you know, so, and his research is over the last 40 years now, around 80% of the folks that he works with, within a year to a year and a half, are completely reintegrated into the society, into the culture without medication. He does use medication. He uses it in the lowest dose and short periods of time. But that also says 20% of the people don't respond. So I don't, again, who knew it was so complicated? I don't think we're ever going to find a magic silver bullet for mental health disorders. But I think we have tended, we talk about being a biopsychosocial disorder, and if you're not a humanist, you'll add spiritual on that. But we've emphasized the bio and not so much the psychosocial. Partly that's because the medications do work quickly, and we have a system that demands that. That we're not going to probably have, at least public mental health systems, that are going to let someone be treated for a year. Because if you can give them a couple of pills and keep them on it, they'll at least maintain some level of behavior. So I'm very intrigued by it. That open dialogue is now being replicated in this country, in Boston or Massachusetts. And so a couple of other spots are trying it as well. And I actually wish I were younger, because I would be jumping on getting trained to do it.
Well, that makes me think about, I don't know why my agency decided that they wanted to start giving me all of the schizophrenic clients. So I work for 3 different agencies, but this one agency, they decided that, oh, Candace, we're going to give you all the schizophrenic clients. And this idea of, I'm gonna just sit here and just enter your world and just listen to you and non-judgmentally tell me, what's going on. And I find that I have much higher compliance, medication compliance, participation compliance, and I'm not sitting there trying to battle their delusions or trying to, it's just like you got 7 million people living in your head. Okay, well, tell me about those 7 million people. What are they saying? You can, okay, and I just go with the flow. I had one guy, there's a tiger follows him around. First thing, as soon as he come in, is the tiger in the room with us today or not? No, the tiger's not here. Okay, well, if the tiger shows up and bothers you, let me know. Or, a guy, his angel. Oh, when was the last time you talked to the angel? Well, I'm a little bit down because my angel hasn't visited me in about 2 months. I'm sorry that your angel hadn't visited you in about 2 months. And so I just kind of go with them and accept them in their world. And we still talk about, again, coping skills, though, because, if that tiger being in the room is causing you to start going in the grocery store and you screaming because you see this tiger walking down the aisle in the grocery store, well, okay, we got to figure out some coping skills. How do you deal when the tiger is in the room? Maybe we don't ever get rid of that tiger, but how can we develop some coping skills so that when that tiger does come, you can deal with it and you're not afraid that it's going to jump on you and bite you? So that sort of goes along that path of what you're saying of, I'm not necessarily trying to get rid of your delusions and your hallucinations. I want to help you learn to live with them if we can't get rid of them, you know. And then oftentimes once you build a certain level of rapport with them and they go, you know what, this Depakote, good God, I don't see that tiger every day when I take that Depakote. How about I take the Depakote and I'll still come see you, you know, and they sort of develop that level of compliance with different types of treatment.
So I think it was John Nash is the subject of The Beautiful Mind, who was a schizophrenic, and my understanding was that at the end, like, he became able to acknowledge, yes, these are delusions, and accept it on that level. He kept seeing things and experiencing them, but was able to, you know, I think was a Nobel laureate for game theory and economics. Like, he was really a functional person. So one of the things I also saw in Curiosity Stream was talking about the fine line between madness and creativity, and how many people with mental health disorders have been incredibly productive. I don't know if anybody can just sort of address that of when does it cross over from being very creative, and what are the relationships to somebody who is extremely creative, has free association, sees things, you know, intellectual insights that other people don't get, versus when it crosses over to, you know, when it becomes pathological. And
When you see a psychiatrist.
I was going to say, I got plenty to say on that, but I'll let somebody else talk.
No, people are interested in this. How many people are fans of Homeland? Homeland. The series. Showtime. The main character is the woman. The main character is actually based on Kay Jameson, and Kay Jameson is one of the world's experts on bipolar disorder. She herself has it. Wrote a memoir, Unquiet Mind, about her struggles with the illness. And she's interested in this issue, and she has studied creativity and mental illness, and has a book, Touched by Fire, and I think shows pretty conclusively that a lot of the great English poets struggled with bipolar disorder. And she recently came out with a biography of Robert Lowell, a great poet who had, I think, pretty terrible bipolar disorder. You know, the exact connection between creativity and certain mental illnesses, I'm not an expert on it, but my impression is that there's a correlation, but exactly the mechanism, I don't think anybody knows. My concern with that is that it sometimes tends then to minimize the terrible suffering that a lot of these people have, and that other people with those illnesses have. That's where I think we have to be cautious that even, you know, many of these people lived short lives because they died by suicide, and they also suffered considerably.
yeah, I think one of the gists, so Dr. Nancy Andreessen, neuroscientist and neuropsychiatrist, chair of psychiatry at the University of Iowa. So I think part of what she was trying to do is point out all of these people, Virginia Woolf, Edgar Allan Poe, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Bertrand Russell, Isaac Newton, Einstein may have been schizotypal, and had, a lot of these people have had several relatives with schizophrenia, if they themselves weren't that. And to try to, one, help get rid of the stigma, and maybe we can talk about if you guys, how much you see stigma as a barrier to getting treatment. And two, just like we saw when we had a discussion with the peer group, recently, these people still have tremendously productive, valuable lives where they contribute so much to society. So I understand your risk about you don't want to minimize what they're going through and suffering, and some die by suicide, but it's to help see that, you know, this is part of our valuable community, and we shouldn't shove these people off to the side.
Can I address Nancy Andreessen study? So that's a you know, well-known and very interesting studies showing that she's basically showed that, you know, the relatives of very creative people often have higher incidence of mental illness problems, particularly some of the psychoses. She's working with a very atypical group, however. If you actually look population-wide, so these are all high IQ, very well-educated people who've had a lot of cultural background. If you look across the population, there's essentially no correlation between creativity and and schizophrenia, for example. If you're looking across everybody. If you look at the select group of people, you see, yes, that there's often a correlation. And I've known a number of individuals myself, they're very creative academics, and I find out that they have a sister or brother in a mental hospital. And that's not uncommon. But among the general population, that's not a good correlation to draw.
That's a good point. I think her original study was with the Iowa writers
Yes.
group, which one of the most, the oldest writing group, very creative, and then she expanded it to people that had won Nobel Prizes for various things.
And
Very
that's,
different.
so that's true of those two very unusual and atypical populations, but not true broadly.
Okay, Elaine, your question?
I'm Elaine Miles, and I'm a chaplain, and I run a suicide support group. And one of the things I've noticed is I think the correlation is a coping correlation. People who have access or have been inspired as young people to have a creative outlet will use that in light of the stressors they're having due to their own mental illness or the mental illness of family members. So instead of it being a genetic correlation, I agree with Mark that it's not, but instead what it is a way to cope. And so I think, this has been used as an argument for arts in schools, in public schools, so that all children will have access to a way of self-expression in a time when they feel out of control. And that's how it works for some people, that this ability to speak for yourself in your own way, which is what we see with the poets who revolutionize how we see language, is because they needed to speak in their own way to be able to put words to this experience they weren't seeing with anyone else. And that's the connection to creativity, and why a lot of people encourage it for all people, so that you can have it as a coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm. And so many poets have said that they've come from really traumatic backgrounds. As many writers have said exactly what you've said themselves.
Can we back up just a little bit? You mentioned.
Can you speak into the... If you can hold on a second for the mic. Yeah, the one I used on.
While we waiting for the mic, well, I would say as a bipolar sufferer, a person who's living with bipolar disorder, when I'm having a hypomanic episode, so my form of, we call it bipolar 2 because I've never had a severe manic episode. I've never had a psychotic episode. So when I have these hypomanic episodes, the creativity that you're talking about, I cannot explain it. Like, it is something that has to be dealt with. You know what I'm saying? It's not like I can just be like, and not every hypomanic episode do I feel the same level of creativity. I know this book, the second book that I'm working on, just know that if it's good, probably 50% of it was written in a hypomanic state, because I can feel it coming on and I'm like, oh, great. I'm going to go right now for like 24 hours a day for like the next 3 days. Not 24 hours a day, I'm exaggerating. But no, like I really will get like a significant amount of work done, and I've just I have personally developed the skills to be like, okay, I know what this is. I know how to channel it. I know what I need to do to deal with it. I know how to keep this from getting, like, I have developed those skills and that insight. And I've worked with a number of clients who the same sort of thing in terms of the creativity becomes a big deal. But you're absolutely right. Like, it definitely doesn't happen with everybody. There are plenty of people who it's like, the creativity piece is not there, but it can get pretty powerful for me personally.
Do you experience that as a pleasurable experience when you're having that hypomania, aside from being really productive, or is it?
So for me, the depression side is where I suffer. A hypomanic episode, again, if I notice it and I recognize it and I know it's coming on, I'm like, yes, I'm gonna get work done. I'm gonna feel good. Like, I'm gonna just get so much done, and it's gonna be great. I have had some hypomanic episodes though where it went on, like it just went on too long, and then I started to feel like a bunch of anxiety, and and it was like, okay, I'm ready for this to be over. So pretty much what I do to deal with that is I sleep. So I I make sure that I'm getting plenty of sleep. And oftentimes it'll come on if I'm not consistent with my medication or something like that. But it's the end that I suffer on is the depression end. And that's like medication, no medication, counselor, therapist, no counselor. Like the depression side is what gets me. But a hypomanic episode, all day long, I'm like, bring it on, come on.
We'll come back to that in a little bit. Ronnie, you have a question?
Yes, if we can back up just a little bit, please. You mentioned methane or methyl, something or other, becoming...
Methylation related to epigenetics?
Yeah.
Right. How does that get, I don't know the terminology, but how does that get on the gene in the first place, or what have you?
So there are a group of enzymes which are very ancient, which do this. They're called methyltransferases, and they basically, as they say, they take a methyl from somewhere else.
Where else, though, is what I meant? Is it like pollution or what?
No, they're what the hell? It's a small chemical that is made normally in the body. Sorry, what? Yeah, it's in the blood. Yeah, it's not. This is not a result of pollution. I mean, you have methyl groups on every kind of organic molecule in your body. They're easy to come by. I think these particular ones are taken from a small vitamin-like molecule, and I'm blanking on the name of it. But then they get added to the DNA, and they're part of your normal. It's not that this is a bad thing. This is most of the DNA in most of your cells has methyl groups for the switches for the genes that shouldn't be on in those cells. So in your your brain cells, lots of the genes involved in hemoglobin or the keratin in your skin, you don't want those expressed in your brain. So those the parts of the starting ramps for those genes are all heavily methylated. So that's a normal process, and it's also something that there seems to be a low level, maybe this is too technical, but this is going on all the time. All right.
No, it's a natural biological thing, not introduced from the outside. That's really my overall question. But another question, if I may, you would, when contaminants, you mentioned drugs, oxycodone, cocaine, what have you, get involved in get chemically involved in the genetic material in the individual. How does that present in that human, and not his or her offspring, but that person himself or herself? Do you understand my question? I mean,
certainly. Well, to go back to what Mark is saying, the drugs are influencing this normally occurring process. You have step back for a moment. Every cell in your body has your entire genome. But as Mark was saying, even though a nerve cell has your entire genome, the only part that is expressed, hopefully, has to do with that neuron. And all the other genes are turned off. And one of the switches that keeps them off are these methyl groups. There are other chemicals, I think, acetyl groups, for instance, open up the genome that have it expressed. And what is thought to happen is that if I'm abusing opioids, it's going to influence the genes who give instructions to produce opioid receptors. So my abusing oxycodone is going to, through this epigenetic mechanisms, are going to influence the number of opioid receptors, for instance, that I produce. And that's going to contribute to my developing an addiction. And they've identified, for instance, they've identified some epigenetic mechanisms that seem to protect us from becoming addicted. And those epigenetic mechanisms get undone by heavy abuse. And again, it's a new field of study. If you Google epigenetics and drug abuse, you'll pull up stuff. A lot of it is very technical, but you can start to get a flavor of how this is going on. But it's a natural mechanism. We're not talking about contaminants or pollutants.
It sounds fantastically complicated chemically at any rate.
Oh, I mean, I look at it and my main reaction is, I'm glad they didn't have this when I was in medical school, because I'm not sure I could have passed the test.
My uncle on my dad's side was a schizoaffective. There's a bunch of people on both sides of my family that are bipolar, and just about everybody in my family's got some form of anxiety or depression. Is there a scientific explanation how you could explain how I ended up with all of that?
I'm sorry, I can't give you a personal diagnosis or history, even if I was a real psychiatrist like Andy here. But we do see that in many cases, certain extreme mental distress does run in families, and in some cases it seems that it's related to some rare genes. In other cases, it seems it's related to sort of very dysfunctional family politics, which get passed down as cultures of dysfunctional family organization from generation to generation. In some cases, it's probably both.
Yeah, and I was going to say, certain disorders are just like egregiously overdiagnosed. And bipolar disorder is one of those diagnoses. When somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, I've got bipolar disorder," then we got to have a real long conversation, because they just throw bipolar out like it's, candy from Halloween. It's just way over diagnosed. So that's one thing I would say, is just because everybody in my family has it doesn't mean that everybody in your family really has it. Like, it was probably, and if one person were to go to the doctor and say, "Oh yeah, my aunt has bipolar," or "My mom has bipolar," now automatically the doctor's going to be more like, "Oh, okay, well yeah, you probably do have bipolar as well." And people use certain terminology, and unless the clinician or the doctor or whoever really takes the time to split those hairs, well, what do you mean when you say mood swing? Then they're going to get, you go in and say, "Yeah, my mom has bipolar, I have mood swings, and sometimes I get really irritable and I throw things." Okay, well, you got bipolar. No, that's not bipolar. That's not the definition of a mood swing. I woke up in a good mood and somebody said something to me and I was in a bad mood. That's not the definition of a mood swing. So I would be careful with that, pay attention to who did the diagnosing, more so than the actual symptoms. I mean, the symptoms are important, but I want to know who did the actual diagnosing. Like, not to be funny, but like if I get an assessment for a client from a previous agency and I see at the bottom that the diagnosing clinician was not fully licensed, they were an associate level, I'm already taking that with a grain of salt. You know what I'm saying? Because you have not been in the field long enough to know what a man, to really, you have to, when you see a manic episode in the eyes, a manic episode. When you see an actively psychotic schizophrenic, active psychosis and schizophrenia, and somebody who's only been in the field for, 3 months, 6 months, or somebody who doesn't take the time to actually think through those things, everything is not, I've seen bipolar mania. I've seen it, and it is not I was in a good mood, and then I was in a bad mood, then I was in a good mood.
Arnold, could you just weigh in on that? Like, how subjective is it in your experience where it's just a behavior and it's so easy to make a misdiagnosis? I think a lot of people bear multiple diagnoses.
Yeah, well, anybody who's been in the system, in the most of my experience is in the public mental health system. Anybody who's been in the system for any length of time has an armload of diagnoses. Diagnosis in psychiatry and in mental health is notoriously unreliable, and because it does depend on who you are, what your training is. Unfortunately, for some people, it depends on who the last drug salesman that came into your office was, particularly the emerging childhood bipolar disorder. We're seeing 3- and 4-year-old children now put on medications because they're bipolar. I don't know how you separate out a normal 3-year-old from someone with bipolar disorder, but it turns out that the person who kind of developed that diagnosis was making lots of money from risk withdrawal. So,
And I want to come back to that, to the lobbying, just a few minutes.
But anyway, but the research, even one of the books I had is the Book of Woe, and the development of the DSM-5, and they had huge problems. In fact, they ended up having to delay publication because they couldn't get enough really good, reliable agreement between various raters as to what would constitute what diagnosis. So it really is very subjective, which isn't the same as saying that there isn't a problem, you know. But what the problem is, and the other problem we have generally in the field is we don't necessarily have any treatments that are connected to a particular diagnostic category.
And is that your experience? And are things heading in a better direction, or are you guys stuck right now?
I hope the former. I hope not the latter. No, to what Arnold said, I think if you are a consumer, a patient, however you want to call it these days, I think you want to always question everything. And a diagnosis in the mental health field is, as Arnold said, is very difficult, notoriously unreliable, and you always want to question, you always want to get a second opinion. These drugs are not benign, and again, as Arnold alluded to, we took drugs that were very effective acutely, and we kept too many people on them for too long, and created a lot of drug-induced problems, I think. And I think we all owe a big debt of gratitude to Wakefield, whose book Anatomy of an Epidemic has brought our attention to this.
Whitaker, not Whitfield.
His books are on the list.
Yeah, Whitaker, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Jerry Wakefield.
So not to confuse with Andrew Wakefield, the anti-vax.
No, I'm actually thinking of Jerome, because the confusion there was the issue of diagnosis. I think one of the people that writes about it very well is social worker Jerome Wakefield, and what are actual diseases and what are harmful dysfunctions. I think he has a very nice distinction on that. So, always question diagnoses. If it's a serious diagnosis, always get a second opinion. And any recommendation of medication, the same sort of thing.
And it's almost like a diagnosis can't be made. It's almost like you have to have seen it or worked with the person for a long enough time, because it depends on what the person reports that day. If they come in and they report to me that they've seen things, but they've never told anybody else that they see things, so it also depends on what you say.
So I'm going to kind of maybe move the conversation in a slightly different trajectory, and I'm not sure that this is going to be completely well formulated, but I was just reflecting on where mental illness is in this continuum of human evolution. And if we think about the last 70,000 years, at least in recorded history, we know that there's been incidences of alternative psychosocial dynamics that are, reported in many different cases. But if we look at the last, 50 to 60 years, globally, we have never been so urbanized, so many people in such tight constructs and requiring just incredible social dynamics with each other. And we've also globally never been as affluent as we are now, in the sense that many children, many young adults, people are not working, they don't have jobs, whereas they did, through much of our recorded human history. Kids were out picking berries or, helping to skin animals and things like that. And I'm just wondering if this kind of prevalence now of mental health or psychosocial disorders is kind of a reflection of humans who were adapted to be busy and active and working, and we're not anymore. And is there anything to that? And so we're kind of, I think what Elaine said about we don't have creative outlets and kids are stressed out and we have all these social pressures and we don't know what to do with them. And, I don't know, again, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm curious to know what your reaction is to that.
Can I start? So I would, if you look historically, of course, it's very difficult to make diagnoses retroactively, and I think the APA rightly says so, but you can find accounts of people with behaviors that are recognizably like depression or recognizably like anxiety. But the psychoses, the true madnesses, they sort of disintegrate. You can't find clear instances of someone who would meet criteria for schizophrenia, for example, and or bipolar, to my knowledge. But you can find that people certainly had aberrant behaviors in the past. As Arnold mentioned, there's now a number of replications of studies that show that if you have grown up in a city, you have more than 50% higher risk of becoming schizophrenic. And that's more or less independent of where you are living currently. And so there's lots of question about what it is that's driving this. So one of the big psychosocial changes has been the coming together into a mass culture, into large complex cities over the last 5,000 years, especially in the last 100 years. It seems to me unlikely that such a change would not stress our minds, which have evolved for small, fairly intense hunter-gatherer band relationships. It would not stress our minds in a variety of different ways to live in these mass anonymous societies. Maybe I'll turn it over to Andy at this point.
No, it's a very good question. People have come up with the idea of what they call mismatch theory. The mismatch between the environment we were designed for and the environment we now live in. Just to give you one example, you want to think of a McDonald's Big Mac meal as a monument to your Stone Age inheritance. All of us have cravings for fat, but it's the fat of lean game meat. Now McDonald's gives it to us in high-fat hamburgers. We all have cravings for sugar, but the original sugar was ripe fruit. Now we get high fructose corn syrup, we get tons of sugar. And so we now have the obesity, diabetes type 2 epidemic. And that's in part because of the mismatch between the food we've created and those foods are often what are referred to as supernormal stimuli. I'll take a brownie over a peach any day. And I try not to, but so there's a mismatch, and that leads to diabetes, heart disease, and so a lot of the medical illnesses that we have are really a mismatch. And as been brought up, schizophrenia. There's overwhelming evidence now that if you are raised in an urban environment, your risk of schizophrenia as a young adult is, twice. And what is that? All of us every day see more strangers in a day than our ancestors would have seen in a lifetime. And so that's constantly, just outside of our awareness, triggering stress all the time. Just a little bit of social stress all the time. We sort of get used to it. But what's a lifetime of every day, just a little shot of social stress? So If you look up the evolutionary psychology, mismatch theory, you'll see a lot of things. The earlier question of teenagers and children, if you look in hunter-gatherer societies, children learn by imitation and play. You know, nailing 7-year-olds to desk for 10 hours a day is an evolutionarily novel situation. You know,
Particularly males.
particularly, no, that's a good point. We're talking about mental illness. I think that's a great point. The diagnosis of ADD now is given all over the place. But look up, again, I think a wonderful paper that's very accessible called The Response Ready Individual. And their argument is that if you look at ADD, it's the description of a hunter. And it's also the description of the defensive linebacker in football who have tremendously high rates of ADD. And it's seen as an illness, but it's actually a suite of adaptations that are very successful in other environments. The modern classroom is 300 years old. We're at least 200,000 years old. And so if anywhere you look, I think you see the kind of mismatches that you raise the question. The question is, how adverse are those mismatches and what impact do those mismatches have and how much do they account for emotional problems in the modern world?
Kathy?
I think you were starting to answer some of my question. We coach college students and young adults with, and other adults too, older adults with ADHD, some of whom were diagnosed in childhood and many of whom didn't get diagnosed until college or even age 43 or something like that. And they really are challenged in terms of a lot of aspects of functionality and just coping. And also with autism spectrum, very prevalent, because my understanding is that about 50% of people on the autism spectrum meet the criteria for ADHD. We usually have thorough neuropsychological assessments, so it's not something kind of made up out of the blue, I think I have ADHD. I guess my broader question is two questions really. To what extent does the evolutional situation of the brain and evolution, society, what everyone is subjected to today, including how bombarded we are with massive amounts of information and activities and just trying to balance our lives. To what extent do you think that is increasing the formal diagnoses of ADHD and autism spectrum? And the second part of my question is, since stimulants are usually the first line of treatment with medicine treatment for ADHD, what evidence is there of structural changes in the brain, especially after a long period of time, like someone coming to us that's been taking stimulant medications since they were 8 years old or 12 years old or something like that, and you know, the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of it over a period of time.
Could I answer the first part and you the second part, perhaps? So I think I would agree with you that, or it sounds like I'm agreeing with you, that perhaps ADHD is as much a creation of our culture as it is of situations that people find themselves in, as a real a fundamental disorder. The one gene that has been best linked to ADHD is what's called the 7R variant of dopamine receptor D4. You can look this up. It turns out that the so-called risk variant for ADHD is about 100,000 to 50,000 years old, sometime originated somewhere in the Middle East, we think. It doesn't occur in any African populations, but it does occur throughout Europe, Asia, and of course people of European descent in the Americas. And it seems to be the evidence that we can reconstruct is that it seems to be a variant that has been actively selected for. That is, it is a recent human mutation that has spread very rapidly, which we think almost always a signature of some positive impact. That is, that whatever change in mind this gene gave, which is probably, they all have small effects in most situations, but whatever little effect this had, it seemed to be enough to make a difference in the lives of the people who had this mutation that was a positive difference. And these were largely the people who spread through the Middle East into Europe and into Asia. Just about everybody in the Native American population of Amazonia has that version, for example. And of course, they live in an environment that's, where you miss a scorpion on a tree, this could have very adverse consequences for you. There's a lot of reason why they may have to be hypervigilant. So I would argue that ADHD is as much of a mismatch between our ancestral environment and our current environment as it is anything that you might regard as a biological disorder. And of course, there's probably many different sort of fundamental biologies that get lumped together under that syndrome. So I'm not sure that I would say that about everybody, but I would say that certainly for a large fraction, especially of the boys. As a former boy myself, I still am. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Sitting in a chair, in a desk, I get squirmy. I like to be outside. I like to be doing things, walking. And I'm perhaps, less willing to sort of play the role of performance. So, of course, I'm eager to get up out of this chair and move around a bit. But I don't think that's a mental illness particularly. I think that's a reflection of normal human behavior over the past 5 to 10 million years.
So you seem to be saying that the reason that our society has become comfortable with it being called a disorder is because it doesn't fit in with the norm, like every 18-year-old or the majority of them from well-off families or families that are professional, so to speak, families expect their kids to go to college, and the kids expect themselves usually to go to college, get the degree, and yet the environment is extremely challenging for a lot of the students with ADHD and on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Let me pose you a sort of hypothetical scenario. Supposing, on current trends, we all have several devices we're connected to and are checking several times every minute, and that's required for competence because you're buying and selling stocks all the time, as many people would like us to do, and making deals and buying things on Etsy, and this would be very good for commerce. So what if you had, let's say, analog disorder? That is, you couldn't multitask, or unitasking disorder. So if you can't actually keep up with all the different news feeds and cell phone, you're going to have a really hard time in the next 50 years. And as this kind of information, if it does become critical for success, that is, people who can manage all of this information overload and buy and sell the right things and control more commerce, they'll succeed. The rest of us, myself included, will have a disorder.
And to just add that, again, it can be overdiagnosed. That's all I'm saying.
Well, it's interesting if that gene tends not to appear in African descent, and look at how many kids of African descent are getting that diagnosis.
Oh, way more black boys are diagnosed with ADHD. It's just overdiagnosed. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's a wonderful question because it illustrates, I think, what we're up against. And when I was trained, ADD was a disorder, okay? It's an illness, so it's stigmatized, and you're given rid of it. And here, I think in your question illustrates what I think is exciting about the present. Because now we have the genetics, and we also have a much more powerful theory, evolution. And as Mark was saying, that gene is found in greatest concentration in South American populations. Who are the South American, the people that populated South America? That's the furthest away from the Middle East where this gene popped up, right? It was positively selected for because it may have contributed to exploratory behavior. Some of the people who work with this have called it the "don't tread on me" gene. And so it was positively selected, and you have the greatest concentration in Amazonia. Another interesting experiment was done. The British were saying, we terribly overdiagnosed ADD. We were saying to the British, you underdiagnosed it. So they did this cross experiment with the Brits, went through some of our records, we went through some of theirs, and it turned out they had lower rates of ADD than we did. Well, you know, who settled the Americas? Was the "don't tread on me" Europeans. You know. And so is it a disorder, or is it a suite of traits that are very successful in certain environments? It's not accidental, I think, that athletes have high rates of ADD. There was a football team that made it to #1 in NCAA for a couple of weeks. And a friend of mine worked with this football team, neuropsychologist. Every single member of the starting defensive unit carried the diagnosis of ADD. This was the best defensive football unit in a very competitive sport. So what do we do? And I think to call a child as having ADD and stigmatize them is not useful. I think you want to think of it as a suite of traits that doesn't work well in a classroom. But then I think as parents and as mental health providers, we're in a bind. Well, this child is not going to grow up to cross the Bering Straits and settle South America. That child has to grow up in the current world. Well, do we medicate them, right? The medications work. But we know there are potential long-term risks to those medications. They have epigenetic impact on the brain. And all of us may know or have seen people who were ADD treated with the stimulant medications have a strong family history of substance abuse, and you're increasing the risk of substance abuse for that individual. We also know that these drugs for people without ADD enhance performance. I don't think I have ADD, maybe a little, but if I took these drugs, I would perform much better. And I think some of the prescriptions of these drugs are going to people who, you'd be hard pressed to say they have ADD, and they're basically on performance enhancers. I mean, this is how complex the problem is. If you go into a college classroom now, conservative estimates are that 2 out of every 10 students are taking stimulants that are not legally prescribed. And the rate of that stimulant prescription goes up as you go up the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So your top schools have high rates of stimulant use. So the top colleges are sort of becoming like the Tour de France. A lot of no, I mean it's not a level playing field anymore, right? So I think it's much more complex, and our understanding, I hope you can see it, is enhanced by the genetics, by evolutionary theory, and it becomes a much more complicated and interesting problem.
It's also confounded with athletes because you can now pass the drug test. You can take Adderall, which is a stimulant. If you've got an ADD diagnosis, you can now have stimulants in your urine, and it will be accepted. You won't be kicked out of the league anymore.
But it may not, but here's the other
which comes first.
But the other thing is interesting, it may not help athletic performance. I have athletes as patients that are on these drugs, and when it comes to game time, they're in a dilemma. Because if they take the drug, they can remember the play in the huddle when they get out. But then once they get out of the huddle and start the play, they're too focused and they lose peripheral vision. If they don't take the drug, their athleticism is better. Their peripheral vision is better, but they leave the huddle and they can't remember the play. No, this is no.
I don't want to cut off, but I have an actual client that I saw many years ago where the wife brought him in because she thought he had adult ADHD. He was a very, very successful DC lobbyist, and he finally agreed to go on medication because he cared about her, and she said that was kind of a condition. And within less than 2 months, his business started to go to hell. And because he was all the time on the phone doing this, doing that, doing this, doing that. And so she agreed that he could go off the medication because she then decided she valued her lifestyle more than she valued her marriage.
I'm curious though if you know of, could you just answer briefly if you know of structural damage to the brain, or if studies that verify that, or resistance after a period of time?
Almost all the psychiatric medications have some long-term effect on brain structure and function. Most of your clinical trials at FDA approval last 6 weeks to 6 months. And they say, oh, they're safe. And then you get to somebody for 6 years. So the long-term studies on ADHD medication generally is that the folks who are on it perform much better for the first 12 to 18 months. And then their performance tends to fall below people who are not medicated.
I think we still have several more. I'm going to sneak in one question, and then we really appreciate this participation. And then we're probably going to start wrapping up, depending how long the speech is going, another 20-ish minutes. And I think we'll have to. Okay. So I'm going to sneak in one question if I can. Okay. Arnold and Mark, you had mentioned sort of tongue-in-cheek that it was really good for commerce to have people plugged into 20 different things and buying stuff at the same time. You had mentioned, not tongue-in-cheek, that the pharmaceutical lobbies are playing an inordinate role in shaping the types of treatments we're doing. Can you talk about that a little bit? And Andy, I might ask you also with medications, talk about that.
Well, what SmithKline and Prince just paid 2.1 billion, was it? And Johnson & Johnson, 1.5 billion for essentially off-label marketing of the drugs. I'm more familiar with Risperdal. It's not, I don't think, in the thing, but if you go to America's Favorite Criminal, there's a long 15-part series on Johnson & Johnson and their subsidiary Janssen and their marketing of Risperdal, primarily to adolescents, children and adolescents, and the elderly, off-label. And they paid, I think it was $1.5, $1.6 billion fine. The next day, the stock market, their stock went up because everybody thought it was going to be worse. And Gorski, who was the head of Janssen at that time, is now the head of Johnson & Johnson. And they made 15 or 16 billion on that particular drug. It's still being used for kids. Causes males to grow breasts and sometimes even lactate.
And do you have any thoughts on the problems with drug companies funding so many of the studies?
Again, I think it's very complicated. And you have these awful things where, like you were saying, risperidone was marketed as if it was a new second-generation antipsychotic, an atypical antipsychotic, and it really was not, and it had a lot more problems. I find myself in an awkward position because the drug companies have developed drugs that are crucial, and I'm glad I've got them. I remember when we didn't have some of the newer drugs, and I'm deeply appreciative for these drugs because they've helped a lot of my patients. But I think we have oversimplified the side effects. I think we've terribly oversimplified the impact of using them chronically, and I think we've overprescribed them to a lot of populations, and that's what's so valuable. And I encourage people to look at Whitaker's work. But I would not want to my, 40 years ago when I did my training, I only had only had the drugs I had then. Yeah, and that's why
Luminol and that kind of thing.
no, but I think you want to question everything,
Again, from my perspective, we have overemphasized, and in the public mental health system, again, is where I'm most familiar, docs and drugs are the most expensive things. And in order to maintain the ability to have those, they've eliminated the more of the psychosocial stuff. So that now the purpose of the public mental health system is maintenance, not treatment or cure. So in my more cynical moments, which occasionally I have, I've said that the mental health system is not designed to help people. It's designed to maintain, so it's really hard in the public system, for example, to get psychotherapy if you're an adult. So I think the drugs are often necessary and never sufficient.
If you want to share in those cynical moments, Ben Goldacre has a position in the UK that wrote Bad Pharma, and that goes through a lot of episodes where you just see, even though the drugs are critical, even though there is a lot of good science, there's also a lot of purposeful mismanagement in pursuit of profits.
I think one of the things on his eyes on the psychopharmacological industry is one of the resources. And the thing about Bad Pharma that is scary is that he doesn't limit himself to behavioral health. He's really talking about, in general, the drugs that people use. And you know about, some of the drugs that turn out to be, the blood pressure meds. I can't even come up with a name right now. Because, again, as one pharmaceutical executive said, we don't develop cures, we develop customers.
A while back, I was given a low-dose maintenance of antibiotics. And 4 years later, I was told to stop taking it because it caused muscle problems. And that's after 4 years of taking it. But my question is that, is it possible to have just one gene linked to mental illnesses? Because they're also linked together. I mean, schizophrenia is hallucinations. Bipolar is up and down, but you can also have the psychosis and the hallucinations with it. I think there's a link between all of them. Is it possible that there could only be just one gene, but it's according to how strong or how whatever, I'm not real good at genes, but that they could find if looking for it? It wouldn't necessarily be able to give you a person a diagnosis, but maybe know that they're prone to a mental illness.
Can I address that? Thanks. So, first of all, there's no single gene for any mental illness, so I can't, look at a particular spot in your DNA and say, well, there's a schizophrenia gene and you've got it or you don't. We can say two things that are relevant. First, that insofar as common genetic variants, which most of us have in differing numbers, insofar as those are related to your risk for mental illnesses of various sorts, many of the variants give you slightly increased risks for a wide variety of mental illnesses. That is, if you have particular versions of calcium channels or particular versions of various transmitter receptors or things like that, you are slightly more likely to get, schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression, and what have you, and autism, or what have you. But it's all, infinitesimal risks across a wide variety. On the other hand, there are individuals with, big chunks of DNA missing who have perhaps schizophrenia and a whole host of other things. So schizophrenia is not the only thing wrong with them. But if you're missing, 50 genes, which some people are, some people walking around are, 50 genes that have been conserved for the last 200 million years, and you're trying to do without them, well, yes, you're going to have a lot of problems, and mental illness may be one of them. And then you can say, well, that's attributable, your problems are attributable to that particular missing chunk of DNA, that you're missing 50 genes that most people have. But again, it won't be specific for a particular kind of mental illness. It'll be a whole host of problems. So typically people like that often have distinctive facial features, distinctive ways of trouble walking, or a variety of other issues, as well as being psychotic.
I did have had the DNA testing done that can tell me what my body, whether it's a medication is good for me or bad for me, or in between. They also said they could, they tested my pain resilience and said that I was prone to tolerate pain very, much more than a lot of other people. How do they do that? I mean, test your pain level, but in a DNA, but they can't, know that somebody's going to have a mental illness or has a mental illness.
Okay, can I address that? Sure. So most of the variation in the acuteness of pain comes from a small number of channels for an ion called sodium, basically, which is sodium is the ion that is used to excite neurons. So you have pain neurons in the periphery. If you have a particular variant or some variants of the sodium channels that make them more excitable, you're much more likely to receive pain, activate your pain neurons from the same kind of touch. So much of the variation in pain is really simple biochemically. So that's why we can sort of look at your DNA and give you some indication. It's not perfect. It's not even very good, but it's better than with other kinds of mental distress. And I guess that's because it's really physical distress and it's mediated by just a few channels. So that's why that can be done. But mental distress, there's a number of different ways that can happen, and although there are biological correlates, it's not caused by typical variants in most of the genes.
Can I ask one question?
How about we move on?
If you have people, like you said, with 50 missing genes, how do you know for sure that mental illnesses cannot be passed down in genes from generation?
Oh, that can be passed down. There are a few cases. I mean, typically people are missing that big a chunk of DNA. They typically don't succeed very well on the marriage market, on the mating market, so to speak. But just a second. So, but yes, if you have, there are a few really rare mutations that you can live with reasonably well, and you may well pass them on to your children. So there are a few families where I would say it's very likely that there's specific genes that are associated with mental illness, but that seems to be relatively a very small fraction of mental illness where that's true. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi. I come from a scientific perspective. This is my first humanistic forum, and I had a comment, but it might have somewhat of a spiritual component, and am I allowed to say, okay. Basically, in response to what Candace said and the other woman over here, my understanding is for the creativity, and people's creativity comes from the right side of the brain. And a lot of times, you hear of a genius that goes off and studies in the wilderness, they're literally meditating, and they're getting their information through the right part of the brain. And so basically, they... I feel like because it's a meditative state, and when you said you get all of a sudden it all comes to you, I feel what's happening is they're getting in touch with the peacefulness within themselves, the nature, the environment around them. A lot of times the left brain is paying bills and things like that. And from what I'm understanding with schizophrenia, and this is just from reading and just experience, a lot of times someone might be misdiagnosed as schizophrenia when they're very creative because they have a hard time going between getting this information and being at peace and being in touch with the universe and not being able to come back and ground themselves. And so a lot of times they're not necessarily schizophrenic, but they tend to not know how to balance their creativity from the right side that's coming in. So, and I don't know if that's humanistic, but
Andy, can maybe say a word first about just that dissociative state, like feeling your out body separate?
Our creativity is coming from more than just the right side of our brain. I mean, I think that's I think that's a too simple a way to look at it, and at least our current state of knowledge, and Mark knows more about this than I do in terms of the neuroscience, is that it looks as if an illness like schizophrenia, when the brain should be maturing at the end of second decade of life, there are signals that are not going off, and that you get abnormal connections, and that's why the illness generally starts at the end of second decade, beginning of third decade of life. Also, things go on where as you live with the illness, part of the cortex may thin out. It's thought to be, at least in part, genes that have to do with sending the signals telling where the wires should lay down.
Can I comment on that? So,
And Mark, I want to ask you this earlier, I tied it to the answer. Can you give just a quick overview of, we start as a baby, we get to an adult, what's happening to the brain in that, and then where can things go wrong in your teenage years?
okay. That's a tall order. First of all, not a whole lot is known about that. So, yes, your brain is getting bigger. As several of you have indicated, your brain is also wiring together. So when you're newborn, you've got basically all the neurons, I should say all of them, the majority of neurons that you're going to have as an adult. There are still, it was actually just shown a little while ago that actually you still have a lot of what are called interneurons that are being generated through the first few years of life and migrating through the brain. And those are thought to be critical for a lot of the psychoses, and it turns out that they're actually being generated in early infancy, so that, as well as late fetal development. So that gives a different perspective on adverse childhood events. So, but the interesting things that we can document are that there are more connections being made. As Candace has mentioned, they typically are the last to be formed are the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain, although that's, again, a little bit graded. So it's the ventromedial areas are recruited first, they're connected first, and then the sort of lateral areas are connected later, which have more to do with impulse control and sort of anticipating one's actions. I would second Andy that although there are asymmetries, so the right sides tend to be more involved in some things, just about everything we do recruits both sides of our brain, and I think it's very much an oversimplification to suggest that a particular function resides on one side or the other, with the exception of language, which is pretty much, in most people, not everyone, in most people is largely on the left. But I would say that, the kinds of things that are happening, in the early, sort of late teenage years and early 20s, we still don't know what's specific going on there. I would say that you're under a different kind of psychosocial stress, and I would argue that the evidence is that in many cases the people who end up getting a schizophrenia diagnosis show dramatic synaptic pruning, sort of indiscriminate large-scale synaptic pruning. They seem to have maybe in some cases 10% of the normal number of synapses. And How that's happening, we think we have some idea now that there are immune responses that are the mechanical effectors, but we don't know what's triggering those immune responses. That's actually research that I'm involved in, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And there's some evidence that certain kinds of psychosocial stresses can trigger that immune response. There's also evidence that certain kinds of infections, either prenatal infections or infections you contract, can affect some of it. In some cases, it's autoimmune. So those are hypotheses we're pursuing, but the fact is we don't really know. But it seems that in roughly half of the schizophrenics, perhaps a little more, people with a schizophrenia diagnosis, there's dramatic synaptic pruning, much more than you'd ever see in a normal individual, which is manifest in the thinning of the cortex. Basically, most of the thickness of the cortex comes from synapses, not from cells. So if you're losing synapses, your cortex shrinks. So that's probably more than we actually know right now.
Thank you, Rob. This may end up being more of a comment instead of a question, but I will try to formulate it into a question. Seems like there are so many different factors, cultural, sociological, that go into what decides the line between certain mental illnesses and how to define them. The easy ones to define being bold-faced mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar, but then there's like a gradient in the middle of all different types as well. So it almost seems to me that it takes an anthropologist, a sociologist, and then a medical scientist, as well as a neurologist, coming together and to be able to truly understand what's going on with a particular phenomenon before research comes out that is usable and applicable in a wide scale or on a wide scale. So moving forward, since mental illness does have such a heavy sociological component, what would be the best way to address issues like that for a practitioner? Because again, it seems that it takes so much understanding to be able to appropriately address an issue of mental illness. And I also want to say Dr. Thomson had introduced me to Salman Akhtar, who talks about the trauma of dislocation. So again, cultural phenomena coming in and layers of cultural phenomena coming into things like diagnoses or in a psychoanalytic diet, and how to go about applying psychoanalysis to a particular individual, that it shouldn't be an even application, that it has to be including of culture and the trauma from various different types of cultural phenomena like immigration or being the children of immigrants or what have you. Minority status could also play into this too. So I'm sorry, that's not a very good question. It's a commentary, but maybe the panel could speak to it.
I think Mark and I have talked on occasion that to really understand it, again, this will be statistical, but if you know a multivariate analysis of variance with 10,000 main effects, none of which are significant, only the interactions, second and third order, become the significance. And so we're talking, I was at a presentation that Mark made the other day, so we need to look at the genes, we need to look at the environment, and there's just so many variables, all of which have some real small influence. And they accumulate in some people to a point where they get a diagnosis. The rest of us have crazy thoughts, but we don't say them out loud, so we don't get diagnosed. One of the therapists, Carl Winnicott, used to say, you have to understand that people who get diagnosed with mental illness also aren't very smart because they say what the rest of us think. So,
or at least some of us.
I think it really is a situation where we don't really have a lot of things that we can say for sure. And again, my preference is for psychosocial treatments, interpersonal treatments, community treatments, not medical and biological treatments. Not that those aren't necessary. Maybe they should be used more short-term and at lower levels. And I think most psychiatrists now are beginning to come to that realization. If you can, get off the medications, but don't do it all at once. Take your time, because there are changes in your brain that the medications create. That if you go off cold turkey, you're going to have withdrawal. And there are now actually centers around the country that are set up for psychiatric medication withdrawal treatment.
So we're going to take one final question.
Could I also
Sure.
Because I think there's a broader question of what's the future of mental illness being asked here. And I would like to suggest a vision that's quite different from what we have today, based on actually measuring the kinds of things. So, right now we can't, the things we can do are put you into a category and say, well, you've got schizophrenia, so we're going to try this list of drugs starting here, there, and there. Or depression, so we'll start with an SSRI. Well, if that doesn't work, we'll try another SSRI. If that doesn't work, we might go to, what's that kind of monoamine oxidase inhibitor or what have you. So we have this list of things that have worked for this diagnosis sometimes in the past. And that's where we are, and we go through this list, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we find one SSRI, the number 3 on the list, that actually works where 1 and 2 didn't. So I'd like to take you back to about 10 years ago in cancer chemotherapy. You had cancer, you went to the doctor, said, okay, you have kidney cancer, and now we're going to go through a list of chemotherapeutic agents that have sometimes worked for kidney cancer, and we'll try number 1, and it didn't work. All right, we'll try number 2. Well, maybe it works, and you're lucky and it doesn't, or maybe we'll go to number 3. By the time you get to number 3, usually the patient is dead. However, there's good evidence, epidemiological evidence, that if you had gotten to, through all of them to number 10, you would have a very good chance of having cured that person. It's just that by between diagnosis and the time it takes to find out whether drug number 1 is working or drug number 2 is working or number 3 was working, usually, the cancer's advanced to the point where it kills you. So we're now at a position where we've looked under the hood, and it turns out that not all kidney cancers are the same. That some kidney cancers look more like liver cancers. Some kidney cancers actually are bone cancers that have metastasized to the liver. Some kidney there are a variety of kidney cancers. So if you look under the hood, so to speak, and find out what the genetic drivers are, so cancer really is pretty much a genetic disease, not entirely, but and it's not that it's an inheritable disease, it's something that the genes have gone wrong in the cancer themselves. If you find out what particular thing is driving that cancer, you have a much better shot at curing that cancer. That's only been possible in the last 10 years. I'd like to suggest that we're going to come to a point in treating mental distress where we actually ask, well, okay, you've got a diagnosis, but let's look under the hood. What's actually happening in your brain at the times when you're sort of feeling this way, when you are engaging with other people? What's going on? That's not possible right now, but I think it will be possible in the next 10 or 20 years. And I think that will give us a more precise idea of what's going on. We'll be able to measure, for example, non-invasively, do you have serious synapse loss? At the moment, strangely enough, it's almost never done. We get, we get schizophrenic diagnoses of people who have essentially no synaptic loss and people who have lots. We treat them the same way. But I think it makes a huge difference. So we'll integrate the biology, your life experience, and a measure of brain activity. And that's how I see the future of mental illness being very different from its present and certainly than its past.
Do you think there would be a better solution?
Can we take one, because I think we're going over time for other people. Can we take one last question here? And then you're welcome to come up afterward to ask the speakers any other stuff.
We've been talking about creative people, and I've recently read that imagination is somewhat different than creativity. Creativity is kind of piecing together known things and connecting dots and whatever. But what I'm hearing a little bit from what you talked about with schizophrenic and so forth, it seems like if we allow people to express imagination, it seems a little weird. Or if we allow people to channel something like ADHD, then it's not something that's really so problematic. It seems to be that with medication, we're trying to suppress some things rather than let people express them. And so the tricky part seems to be how much do you let somebody express it or figure out how to channel it versus suppressing it by medication or by coping mechanism. Am I off here, or does that seem to be kind of a trend that you're either trying to figure out whether to allow people to channel it or to say there's no room for that here, so we got to suppress it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's especially true when it comes to ADHD. Like you were saying, how much do you, how much do you, say, well, you know what, this is the 21st century. You got to be able to sit in a chair for 6 hours a day, period. Therefore, here's the pill to help you do that. Or do you develop some sort of alternative programs that allow children to be more active, that where they learn in different ways. So I think treatment oftentimes involves, it could involve medication. It could involve, environmental changes, sociological, social changes. It just really depends. I think, unfortunately, we can't afford the way society is set up in a capitalistic society, whatever you want to call it. We just don't afford the time and the opportunity to try different types of treatment in addition to the medical, because I am with my clients and stuff, I'm a big advocate for medication, but I'm an advocate for medication only after we are sure or we have a better understanding of what your diagnosis is. I'm not an advocate for you said you saw something, okay, here's some Risperdal. You said you couldn't sit down in a chair, okay, here's some Adderall. Oh, you had some crying spells last week, okay, here's some Prozac. I mean, so many of my clients come to me and they have 10 diagnoses and on 20 different medications. And I often have had the best success with clients who got off of everything and started over from scratch with a better diagnosis, because I've been working with you for a year. Now I know what I see. Whoever told you you had X number diagnosis, now we see something that's different. Therefore, you're going to try a different medication and you're just going to try one. And you're going to use some of the coping skills that we've learned and we've discussed, and that'll have much better outcomes. But it took a year for me. It took a year for this one particular client to have a manic episode. I didn't see the manic episode, so they had all of this medication that was treating stuff that wasn't helping with them. So she got off of all that stuff. She had that year to learn the coping skills, Unfortunately, like you said, in a lot of mental health agencies, I mean, especially with Medicaid and stuff, the funding is not there to support that. So a lot of my schizophrenic clients, they don't have insurance at all. So our agency, lucky enough, anyway, long story short, they qualify for a program. Well, guess how many therapy sessions they get in a year? 8. And then I could put in a special request and maybe I'm going to get 4 more. The most I've ever gotten more was 12, and that was for a sex addict. So you seeing tigers in the corner, okay, you might get 12 therapy sessions in a year. But he can get as much medication management as the nurse tells. If the nurse says you come back or the doctor says you come back every other week, he can go back every other week, and the state will pay for it, but the state will only pay for 8 to 12 therapy sessions. So I think it just depends, like how you treat it, what's the best way to treat it depends. And I think the first and foremost thing, if you don't take anything away from what I say, is the diagnosis. Like it's not considered the diagnosis unless it meets the level of being clinically significant disturbances in your functioning. I get antsy sometimes. That don't mean I have ADHD. But it all goes back to the diagnosing, and you got to get a good diagnosis. Don't let them just throw 10 diagnoses at you. Anyway.
Any final words by anybody?
It just respond to your question. There's a line of Shakespeare's, madness and ugliness, but see how it lights up the sky. I think we have to be careful about that. I have patients who feel like the medication does suppress their creativity, but I have far more who are very grateful for the medications because it allows them to be creative. And there's a woman poet, I'll come up with her name in a minute, who has a beautiful poem actually about what the treatment of her illness, including the medications, allowed her to do. And so I think we have to be careful about romanticizing particularly severe mental illness in any way. I have just to give you one example, I have a patient in my practice now who's a very successful editor and writer. She helps people do op-eds and those kind of things, very successful, and has terrible bipolar blues. And then she's very creative and very gifted when she's stable. And if she's not stable, she's not productive in the slightest or creative.
And as far as romanticizing, I'm sorry, I think about ADHD, we say like, oh, ADHD, people, oh, they can do all this great stuff. And I think sometimes that can be over-romanticized because, again, first of all, I think it's way over-diagnosed. But when you see a kid that, I used to be a teacher. My first career was teaching before I came to mental health. When I had a kid that had ADHD and came in that, like, real ADHD, that child, it was significant disruption in his ability to function. So yeah, while we say, oh, ADHD people, oh, that's great, they got all this energy. Well, this child could not sit still. This child could only, he couldn't socialize. Nobody wanted to be his friend. It was it was not romantic at all. It was not a beautiful thing to be like, oh, he's got all this energy. Sure, he's going to go on and do great things. Well, that's if anybody ever gives him a chance, because he could, it was extreme. So when somebody has a disorder, the thing is, it's a disorder because it's disrupting their life. And therefore, it's not something that should be romanticized, because the definition is that if we go back to the DSM, it has to be a clinically significant disruption in your functioning, which is not a beautiful thing at all.
All right. Well, thank all of you for coming. Thank the speakers. Thank you. Thank you.